Welcome back to the video darkroom, and this time we're going to talk about extension tubes, which are these little devices that you can put between the lens and the camera in order to focus more closely on the subject and get involved in macro photography. So I'm going to review these newer macro extension tubes, a 16mm and a 10mm that you can put together to make a 26mm. It's really the most economic way of getting involved in macro, and it pretty much takes you most of the way there. Not 100% as good as a macro lens, but I'm going to show you that you can get incredible results with these. So let's get involved in the video, and I'll show you the techniques that you need to use and what the alternatives are that you might use to approach macro photography. So your options for doing some close-up work in photography are, I guess most basically, is just to focus as close as you can to the subject depending on the lens that you have, and that will determine how close you can focus, and then you can crop in when you're post-processing the photograph and enlarge the subject as much as possible, but you really can't get very far with that kind of technique. It depends on the lens that you have. Some of them focus closer than others. Some of them really don't focus very close at all, and it varies from lens to lens. Your second option, I guess, is to use a macro lens, and here I have the Sony 90mm f2.8 macro lens, and this will focus close enough to get you right in to a ratio of 1:1 with your subject. So 1:1 means that the image will be life size on the sensor, and that will allow you to blow that up to as large as you want. Great for photographing an insect or a very tiny object, whatever it is that you want. You don't have to go that close. You can do anything from normal photography right back to 1:1 macro photography. So that is the kind of Rolls-Royce way of doing it, but these lenses are quite expensive. I will put the link in the description to this lens, but it's quite an investment, and if it's your first time getting into macro photography, I would recommend that you try something cheaper before you invest this degree of money. Of course, this is a brilliant lens for other things as well. Being a 90mm f2.8, it's a great portrait lens as well, so it can be a general purpose lens for full frame photography. But then what we're going to look at is a cheap option but an incredibly powerful one, and that is to use macro extension tubes. Now I have this little set from Neewer, and I'll put the price of these in dollars and pounds onto the video, but basically they're pretty cheap. I'm guessing that they're about $25, £25 to buy these. There are two in the set. They come apart like this, so you can use one of them, which is a 10mm extension. The second one is a 16mm extension, but you can put the two of them together, and they clip together, and you can add both of them between the lens and the camera, and that will give you 26mm of extension. So basically just take your lens off. The extension tubes will line up with the dots on your camera body, just the same as a normal lens, and then put on the lens, and you've now got your extension tube sitting here between the camera and the lens, and that basically allows the lens to focus much more closely than it would otherwise be able to do. Now, what are the drawbacks compared to going the full way and buying the macro lens? Well, the drawbacks are that your lens will not be optically perfect when it is extended from the camera body like this. It'll be pretty good, but you are taking it beyond the design specification that was intended for the lens. It's going closer in focus than it was originally designed to. So you may lose a degree of resolution, particularly at the outsides of the image. But in my experience, macro photography doesn't always require edge-to-edge sharpness. It's normally the center of the image that you're giving your attention to and focusing on. So I would suggest that that may not be such a drawback. And when you've put 10 millimeters and 16 millimeters on, how much of magnification you're getting will depend on what the focal length of the lens is. So if the focal length of your lens is very long, say it's a 150 millimeter lens, then this is not going to bring you in that close. But if you put this onto a 50 millimeter lens or a 35 millimeter lens, it's creating a much proportionately larger amount of extension, and that will allow you to get in much closer and focus. And I'm showing you various examples of how you might want to do this. So basically there's not much to extension tubes. I'll just take these off again just to show you. Just put the lens back on the camera. So the extension tubes have the usual little catch that allows them to lock onto the camera and lock onto the lens, and inside there are these contacts that allow the camera still to autofocus and control the aperture of your lens. So the lens will operate pretty much as it did before. I'm not sure what would happen with stabilized lenses. Really, that's something that will depend on the camera system and the lens that you're using. But basically everything will pretty much operate as it would have done before, and you can use these lenses and simply adopt your normal procedures, but you're moving in much more closely. Now there are certain things to be aware of when you're involved in macro photography, and that is that your depth of field, the amount that's going to be in focus, is going to be reduced substantially. And if you're using a larger aperture, then you'll find that it's only a terribly narrow area that is actually in focus. So you have to be aware of that. You can, of course, stop down the lens to f16 or f22, but as some of these images demonstrate to you, you lose resolution when you stop a lens down, particularly to something like f22. Diffraction at the iris causes a degradation in sharpness of the lens, and that is something that you don't want, particularly in a macro photograph, because the impact of macro photographs is often in the sharpness and crispness of the image that you get, revealing details that the eye would not normally see. So I would recommend not stopping down to f16 or f22. Maybe f8 or f11 might be as far as you want to go. So how do you get over that situation then of being able to get front to back focus on a larger object? Well, typically you need to use focus stacking. That is where you take a series of images, say maybe 10 images, and each one focused a little bit further along the object that you're trying to capture front to back sharply. So focus stacking is something that's fairly easy to do in Photoshop, and there are various applications that you can use to do that more specifically, but I will show you how to do that in another video. But for the moment, if you're going to use photo stacking, there are two approaches in camera that you can take. One is to move your focus ring a little tiny bit to move the focus down through the object as you take that series of, say, 10 images. That's not the ideal way to do it. The ideal way to do it is to have the camera move slightly more along closer to the image and capture various slices of focus as you move along. Now, why would you do that rather than refocus? Well, refocusing your lens will change the optical performance of that lens. It will change the optical characteristics of that lens a little bit, and each image will not be just an exact copy of the one before, just with a little bit of difference in focus. Whereas if you move the camera along through the image, that will create identical images, which then can be stacked much more perfectly in an application like Photoshop when you come to create your macro photograph. So how would you do that in order to move through the lens? Nearly impossible to do it handheld. Most macro photography needs to be done on a tripod, and you need a device like this. So this is a focus rail, and by turning the knob you can move the camera forwards and backwards on the tripod, and you can move it 1 millimeter at a time, for example, and take a series of 10 photographs to give you a focus depth of about 10 millimeters, or you can go further than that. And also in positioning your camera you can move side to side, so you've got horizontal movement and movement along the axis of the lens in order to create your focus stack. Now I'm going to do a separate video on this device. It's quite cheap. It's probably around $25–30. I'll put the price in the description, and you can use this, mount your camera on it, mount this on the tripod, and then you can control your macro photography much more accurately, and I'm going to show you how to do that. And in that video I'll show you how to use focus stacking as well. So basically that's as much as we want to cover at the moment. These simple extension tubes, and you can get them from Neewer, you can get them from Kinco, you can get them from a whole variety of suppliers. They don't cost very much. There's no point in investing too much money in them. 10 millimeters and 16 millimeters is a good average extension that you might want to use. You could stack even more of them, but then I think you're getting into the realm of significant degradation of your image and the optical performance of your lens. So I would recommend this is probably as far as you want to go. But as you see in some of the images that I'm showing, you can get amazing macro photographs using extension tubes. So I hope you find that helpful. If you'd like to try them out, they're not a big investment, as I say, about $25, and the link to them is in the description. So I hope you enjoy a bit of macro photography, and if you enjoyed this, then please give the video a like on YouTube and subscribe to the channel, particularly if you want to see the next video coming up that will review the Neewer focus rail and tell you how to get involved in focus stacking to create some amazing macro photographs that are sharp from front to back. If you enjoyed this video and got some benefit from it, then please subscribe to my channel. I'll be continuing the series on under $100 reviews, looking at photography and video equipment, and I'll also be covering techniques for Photoshop, Premiere, After Effects and Lightroom. So hit the subscribe button and the bell and you'll be notified of future videos.